Welcome back to another episode of TimeOut with the Sports Doctor podcast, where life, sports, and medicine intersects. We are glad that you are part of this growing community where we strive to help you strengthen your mindset, help you grow your assets, and help you achieve whatever level of success that you want for your life. Go to our website at Dr.Derrick, thesportsdoctor.com, where you can find all the latest content, and you can also follow us on our social media channels. Now, let's get into this episode. So welcome back to another episode of Time Out with the Sports Doctor podcast. And we have another very interesting guest for you today. We have another fellow physician, another fellow surgeon. Dr. Courtney is a general surgeon, where I'm orthopedics. She's a general surgeon, but very glad to have Dr. Courtney Barrows McKeown with us today. Hopefully I got that name right.
Yeah, that's good.
So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Derek. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to conversation.
Absolutely. So as it happens many times on the podcast or in the whole podcasting realm, we have a fellow colleague in common with Dr. Amy Vertrees, who Dr. McKeown will be up with her in her clinical practice. So I wanted to hear about your job transition, number one, as a young surgeon, just like myself. As we know, many surgeons in their first 5 years will transition to a different job. It happened to me in the first year. It happened to you very early on as well. So I think your experiences in that realm is very valuable for other young doctors, and not even just doctors, but for other professionals, because many of the same emotions and feelings and some of the trauma that you've gone through because of a job change will be the same thing that other professionals will go through as well. You don't have to just be a physician to go through some of the similar things and struggles that we've gone through.
Absolutely. I could sing Dr. Vertrees' praises all night long. We'd be here all night, but she's obviously amazing. I'm really looking forward to joining her private practice down in Middle Tennessee. My husband and I are actually doing the big, 20-hour road trip from New Hampshire to Tennessee next week after our house closes. So really excited about that. And her whole team is just amazing. So that'll be my second job as an attending. I have shared more publicly recently about some of my previous issues with substance use and alcohol use disorder, but also coming on as somebody who's not only happy to share hope and wisdom about that, but as you alluded to, I've had some difficult job transitions even outside of that several years later in my early career, particularly with my first job. And that's certainly why I related so well to your platform and your episode that you had on the Boss podcast. We share a very similar experience there. I've grown up in the Northeast, Massachusetts. I've pretty much been up here most of my life, did training in Boston for residency, and then had a brief stint out in the Midwest for fellowship, and had some substance use issues that started in residency during my research sabbatical, which initially I had gotten a handle on, and then between some jarring life transitions and other things, and not really, working a great program, I ended up having a relapse in 2021 in the middle of my fellowship. It was the first time I had some pretty significant consequences as a result, and happy to get into that in more detail, obviously. But ultimately, it resulted in me having a brief suspension of a license in that state. Finally, that actually got me, basically caused me to hit a rock bottom where I realized I need to really get a handle on this, and got me to a level of acceptance in terms of my disease and being accountable for it. And honestly, that's made the biggest difference in that I've now become much more willing and open in terms of working a program. I'm proud to say I'm a little over 3 years sober a couple of months ago, and eventually got my license back in that state and wanted to move back to New England. So I had taken my first job as a general surgeon in southern New Hampshire at a community hospital there. My first difficult transition was also actually less than a year. I was there about 10 months when I had gotten laid off, and the job I had walked into, I think similar to how you shared, was quite different than what I was being sold. You said it best, you're kind of being sold a dream when you interview somewhere. Yeah. And maybe have your blinders on to some things, and maybe just some things you don't even realize you're supposed to know or ask about. And in some ways, though, it was still a really great first job. I had been out of practice for a year before I started there. And obviously, it was my first real attending job. So I did have a really great partner initially who took me under his wing And so, I gained some more confidence in the OR. And then, after the layoff, I had a pretty difficult job search trying to find the right fit. It took about a year almost. And then I had very fortuitously come into contact with Amanda Hill and Amy Vertrees when I joined.
Tag team, the dynamic duo.
Exactly. They really are a dynamic duo, and they're a lot of fun. But that was really just a life-changing experience. I had signed up for their 90-day notice course, and it was actually really funny. I think I had listened to your episode with Amanda from earlier last year, and she was just talking about this free webinar that they were doing called Predictable to Pink Slip, which was going to be an intro to that 90-day notice course. And I had been thinking about doing coaching for a while. I knew I needed to do something different with my job search. I always felt like I was somebody who interviewed fairly well. And so it was a little bit frustrating for me in terms of I'd get interviews and then, it wouldn't go anywhere, or maybe I'd get promised a site visit and I would get ghosted. It was a little bit disheartening. So I knew I needed to do something different, try and control what I could control. And so that I've been listening to Dr. Vertrees' podcast for a couple of years, sort of admiring her from afar. And then they happened to, announce that webinar. So I went to it and then basically asked a fairly simple question. I think I was just trying to get a sense of, was this course going to be right for me? This is my first time engaging in coaching. And certainly as somebody who hadn't been making a ton of income in the past year after the layoff, I had wanted to make sure this was going to be an investment worthwhile. So, I had asked something related to that and gave a little brief intro into who I was. The next morning, I had an email from Dr. Vertrees that was basically, had elaborated a little bit on her answer that she had given in the webinar, but was also like, I also wanted to talk to you about something completely separate. I've been thinking about hiring a third partner. Would you be interested? And that was, I think, maybe December of 2021. I was, after several phone conversations, went down there the week before Christmas and had a job offer before I left the place. So it's been kind of a whirlwind, and it's really funny how things work out. I would not have expected. Obviously, it's easy to sometimes get frustrated and lose a little bit of hope. I kind of always knew that there was some reason I needed to wait as long as I did. I think just based on the lessons I had learned in the past with my recovery and how things really did start working out when I started doing the next right thing. But obviously there were ups and downs to this whole process. And so it's just really cool looking back now and being like, wow, now I get it. So anyways, I'm really excited, and she's obviously amazing. I'm so grateful that she's, I know I'm an excellent hire and I bring a lot to the team as well, but obviously she went out on a limb to really help to me and when she didn't really need to. And obviously this is her baby that she's been building up for years now. So that she's entrusting me to work with her and her team is really, I'm so grateful for. So.
Yeah. Wow. So you just gave me those are probably 3 or 4 episodes.
Yeah,
but I
exactly.
want to first start off by applauding you for, number one, being here, and for truthfully just you're being an open book, because the problem with what's going on right now in society, and the problem with social media, and the problem with being a doctor really is that many times we feel that we have to struggle alone. And many times we wake up each morning, we put on our white coat, we put on our suit, we put on our tie, we put on our scrubs, and we drag ourselves out of our houses into the hospital where other people are depending on us to perform to the best of our ability. And no matter what we're going on, we've learned to compartmentalize our struggles, our problems, and show up for everyone else. And we can continue to do that over and over and over again, and many times just completely ignore whatever problems, addictions, issues we have until they come back and just completely destroy us. But I want to applaud you for the fact that you were able to recognize early enough that your problem did not destroy you. And the other thing I want to say to you, number one, is that you are not your struggles. You are not your addiction. You are not whatever you struggled with. That's something that you just had to deal with. That doesn't define you as Dr. McKeown. It doesn't define you as Courtney, the person. As you found out through going through recovery and going through coaching and other things, you were kind of dealt a bad hand. And from that, it could have destroyed many people who were not as strong as you are, but you're still here. You've embraced your struggles, and now you're willing to help other people through your struggles, which I think is the most beautiful part of all of it. So just want to applaud you for that, number one. And the other thing that came out of this is that you got a job because you reached out for help. So
Yeah.
getting coaching, like I have a seminar going on currently for young physicians, but many times you don't know you need coaching until you're already getting it,
Oh
because
yeah.
we're used to having teachers and instructors, but I didn't even conceptualize what a personal coach was, a life coach. I've had coaches playing sports. I've heard of high level CEOs having coaches, but I never really heard of physicians having coaches until the pandemic, when I joined the Passive MD coaching group and started hearing about everybody doing personal coaching, this coaching and that coaching. I'm like, hold on, what is this all about? So just like athletes need coaches to perform at their peak ability, anybody else, from a lawyer, a physician, we need coaching as well. So I love the fact that you reached out to someone for help and you got a job from it. Not
Yeah.
only did you get help with learning how to go through a job transition, but you actually got the job with somebody who knows your bad parts. So you don't have to walk into the job trying to hide who knows my past. You can be open and you can help other people. And I think that's going to really help your career blossom. And it's going to make you way more than just a physician, which many times we put ourselves in the box of, I'm just a doctor, I'm just a surgeon.
Right.
So I'm really happy that you are in this place where you can be yourself and not have to worry about will your past ever catch up with you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I guess I'm just going to respond, I guess, it backwards, starting with the last point, and that I feel so grateful. I'm actually working for someone or with someone who actually doesn't even see those things as bad things, actually.
Yeah.
I, for a long time, it took me a long time to get to this mindset, and most of my recovery work took several months, but, I was able to realize that, it's not my fault that I have, and it is a disease, but it is my responsibility to get it treated and then manage it. I really I think this quote applies to so many things in life and certainly does for me, but this Maya Angelou quote that says, you do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. You can
Yeah.
apply that to really anything in terms of, so that's honestly how I look at most things in terms of, rather than coming at it from a place of regret or I wish I could go back and do things differently. It's more like, okay, well, now I know I did the best I can at that time, best I could. And if I was presented that same situation now for some reason, I would handle it certainly a different way, having known better. But I think what's really great is that I have viewed, honestly, obviously not the consequences that happened as a result of me using, but overcoming all of those challenges and whatnot as a strength, and obviously talking about it. When everything really went down or, crap hit the fan a few years ago when I had the relapse, I was in a place where I had gotten really dark, and really couldn't see the forest from the trees. I really thought my career was over. And because, of course, that was really the only thing, being a surgeon was all I had thought I was, life and two. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that, I did not do this by myself. I, similar to you, have a personal faith, and God has really just helped me. I mean, he always has been helping me. It's just I've finally realized
Right.
that
Sure.
more. And so certainly by the grace of God, and obviously I've had an incredibly supportive husband. Most spouses would have most likely left at some point in the prior 5 years that this had been a really big issue, and a very supportive family. I'm very close with my parents and my three siblings. And, so having all of those people behind me and all of the people that have been then put in my path after that to help me are, that's really, I feel like I can't take much credit on, honestly, other than just kind of being willing to move forward and not give up. But yeah, I think, and Amy actually was one of the people who gave me that final nudge. Like, I had been thinking about sharing because, again, back a few years ago, I was trying to grasp for any sort of, hope and stories that I could relate to. And frankly, I mean, there were some that were out there, but like I just, for one reason or another, I just couldn't relate to that person. Either they were not a surgeon, they weren't practicing anymore, maybe they didn't have as significant discipline struggles to overcome from a licensing standpoint, whatever it was, I couldn't relate. The only things I could relate to were these, sadly, these suicide diaries that are out there on the internet by somebody who's really trying to, I think, advocate for physicians, but it's sort of in my frame of mind. I could only relate to like the end result, unfortunately, of those. So
Wow.
I felt it was really a calling of mine, and honestly, another purpose I have outside of just being a surgeon, speaking about this and trying to give hope to other docs that basically helping the people that I was a few years ago. So I appreciate you saying that. And yeah, it's been a journey for sure.
Sure. Sure. So let's talk about your ability to relate to other people. So even though you met through recovery, I'm sure other people who dealt with addiction or dealt with alcoholism or drug use, but you couldn't relate to them as it applied to you as a physician. So I think that makes your story even more valid and even more important, because we know in medical school and residency, one of the ways that you release yourself from the stress is with alcohol or partying or whatever. So I remember med school, you study, you had a test every other weekend. So you had your test weekend and then you had your free weekend. Or you had, many times we would test on Monday and the only time you had to go out was a Monday night. But it didn't matter that it wasn't Friday night or Saturday night. Some people would still just go out and party like it was Friday, Saturday, and Sunday all combined, and just get completely wasted on a Monday night as a way to release from all the stress. And then you go home, recover, you're back in class and you're back on it, and you just continue, and then you release again, and then you continue. And that cycle can create an addiction, or it can create a cycle that your body gets used to. What was the beginning of it for you? What was it like? Did you always know that you kind of had a predilection to addiction, or was it something that just kind of gradually built on itself?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So I think in retrospect, I can
Mhm.
look back now, even back to the college days, really my early drinking days, and say I never had a normal relationship, certainly with alcohol. But it wasn't until I really got into recovery, or at least my first, treatment of addiction when I was a resident, that I recognized that. It also is something that I was at risk of. I have, substance disorder addiction runs on both sides of my family, but it wasn't in my immediate family. So it was something that was not present in my day to day life where I was very aware of it. It was just sort of, oh, this, distant relative, or not even distant, but just not outside of our, outside of our immediate family, where you kind of knew some stuff, but it was like, we didn't really talk about it too much. But it became very clear once I got into recovery that I was at risk. And I think that's the whole thing about the disease model. There's multiple reasons why someone may go down that path, but there's certainly a genetic component, just like there would be, not all, cancer isn't 100% genetic, but there is clearly a family history component to it. So similar with addiction, where I was at risk. And then I think, I'm not an expert, of course, in this, but that I think I was basically, as soon as I started drinking, and I really didn't drink until college, I was very straight edge in high school. I was a three-sport athlete, and I really played every single sport at any one point in the year, between AAU and club and all that stuff. So, I mean, frankly, I just never had time to, my schedule was so regimented and I was so focused on that and academics, it really never crossed my mind. I wasn't hugely popular in high school either, and a little bit socially awkward, but at any rate, once I started, in college, it was like everybody did it. I went to
Right.
BC, which is I wouldn't say it's a huge party school, but the sports are a huge part of the social life, and everybody drinks before the football games and the hockey games and at the games. So,
Right.
but I think what I can say is my off switch was never really calibrated correctly. That's probably the earliest signs that in retrospect I noticed. I never had a great off switch. I wasn't drinking all the time, but when I did, I just really, like, things got out of hand more often than I think most people. And then I think in terms of when I actually really noticed, though, the addiction kicking in was in residency. So in med school, I actually is similar to what you're talking about. I did party pretty hard there too, just not as frequent as college, but in between exams, man, like, yeah, I mean, I blacked out multiple times, certainly not proud of it, but that was definitely a big part of the culture, the social culture there.
Right.
And then, yeah, in residency, I had gone to an academic residency program, one of the Harvard hospitals. And so they have a research time built into your residency. And so I had done 3 clinical years, everything had gone really well. And when I went into the lab, it just really wasn't the right fit. I think I was, trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole for a very long time. Was doing multiple projects that weren't related to each other and got overwhelmed really quickly. And I had experimented in the past with stimulants and things like that, but not really in any consistent manner. And then I did taking an ADHD medication to initially help me focus, but that quickly spiraled out of control. I mean, that's really where things first became apparent. Fortunately, because I was on the sabbatical, I wasn't working really clinically very much outside of a little bit of moonlighting here or there. And, I had eventually it got to the point where I was taking so much of this medication, I actually had a psychotic episode that required hospitalization, which is how I got into, I wouldn't even would say recovery, but I got into treatment at least for the first time. And it was mainly outpatient treatment. And that was my first experience also with a physician health program in Massachusetts. I guess I'll just stop there without getting too much into the weeds.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. And when you were going through that and going through the recovery and going through, I mean, really, like you said, you knew that you were struggling. Who was it that you were able to confide in? Was it your husband? Was it a professor? Who was it that was really able to help you get help initially? As healthcare providers, we spend a large portion of our lives focused on our training as well as taking care of other individuals. But I'm calling a timeout because life can change in an instant. We know it's difficult to fathom that a sudden illness, injury, or death could put you and your family in a devastating financial situation. But that's where Dr. Stephanie Pearson and her unique team of advisors at Pearson Rabbits come into play. They focus on empowering physicians like yourself to protect your most valuable asset, your income, and life's most important people, your family. So go to pearsonrabbits.com to make sure that you are protected today.
Yeah, so it was initially, I think, obviously being at home with my husband, he recognized that I was not well mentally. And I had some friends from my residency who I was staying in close contact with who also recognized that as well. And, they took me to the hospital, not the one I worked at, of course, but a different one. And I was later admitted to a kind of an acute mental health facility, which was not substance related. I was actually in a little bit of denial at that time. Plus, I was actively psychotic, so I wasn't really admitting to what I had taken. Obviously, a couple of days later, my urine test results came back like grossly positive, clearly. But I hadn't told anybody from work that I was, basically abusing stimulants. My husband knew, and my parents knew as well. And my program director was kind of generally aware of what was going on, just because, again, I was acting pretty off the rails in those ensuing days before getting into the hospital. And so I had called her and a couple of other attendings I had worked with and clearly sounded not well either. So she had been, talking to my husband a little bit when I was in treatment, mainly to just check in, make sure I was, doing okay. And also to honestly do a lot of things outside of her job description in terms of making sure I was getting on FMLA and those types of things. So I was getting medical leave pay. And when I got out of the hospital, I had a pretty challenging relationship with the doctor who I was doing the research with. And she had kind of done a lot of things going out of her way to help me in terms of letting me do research with her, getting me paid by the department. So I didn't have to work with that individual. And I'm sure that was a mutual decision. I'm sure, I probably was not impressing him too much either. But yeah, so, and then basically she had recommended, because she didn't really know what was going on. Obviously, I didn't really share things with her until several months later, but she wanted me to get evaluated by the physician health program to ensure I was reasonably so stable and able to get back into like clinical training, as I was going to be planning to get back into my PGY4 year about 9 months later. So
yeah, it's great, number one, that you had people from your program that knew that you were struggling and still trying to help you, because many times you just dismissed you're fired, you're whatever, and then you're left to struggle on your own. So the fact that you are still able to stay in the program to some extent means you were able to keep medical insurance and things of that nature, which really allows you to get the help that you need. So I'm glad that that happened.
Right. Yeah. And I think, and it's certainly not to take away from any of those things. I think I had been there for a few years, obviously performed quite well. And so
Yeah,
I think was fortunate that I had a lot of, built up respect reserves from people where they could obviously recognize that this wasn't really me and, something was off. And again, it never affected my clinical performance because I really wasn't clinical at the time. It was more like research stuff. And I only say that just because I imagine it would be much more challenging. And I hope that, a program would be similarly compassionate and willing to help people who are earlier in their career where maybe they don't, know them that well. But I mean, that could have easily happened to me. It was just sort of a perfect storm of things that happened at that time. But I mean, if that had happened to me intern year, would that have
yeah,
been the same situation? I think
yeah,
in my program, honestly, it would have, but I know that that's not the case everywhere, clearly. So I think that
sure.
that definitely needs to change because this isn't an issue that's going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah. And one thing I want to point out to people is that you were still a great resident. You were
Yeah.
performing, like you said, as a good surgical resident, which is not easy. It's very, demanding from a performance standpoint, from a time standpoint, from a sleep deprivation standpoint. But you were still able to do all those things, even though you were struggling on your own. So I want to just tell people that just because someone shows up to work every day and is able to perform from 6 to 5 or 6 to 9 or whatever your shift is, doesn't mean that they're okay. And if you see any warning signs, that's when you need to try to help someone, not when their clinical acumen and clinical performance starts to go down. Because some people are able to compartmentalize and still work it and be, struggling.
Absolutely. And I mean, I don't think that there's a single person who has a substance use disorder that doesn't have a co-occurring non-substance because substance use disorders are a mental health disorder, but I think that there's 0% of people who actually have just that and don't have a co-occurring either anxiety, depression, some other, mental health disorder. And I clearly had anxiety my whole life. It was just not diagnosed until this all came to a head. And
Yeah.
that's obviously controllable now with therapy and for a while medication. But yeah, those are things that, I think it's actually fairly prevalent in our field, having some degree, whether it's anxiety or depression, et cetera. And yeah, I think common misconception for people is that if they were to talk to someone about like, asking them how they're doing, or even just being as blunt as like, are you, especially somebody who's really, really, really struggling, like people worry, oh, if you say something like, are you thinking about suicide, that would actually trigger them to
Right.
do that. And that is very inaccurate. Like that's actually, you should, if you're concerned, obviously not only reach out to them, but make sure that they are getting help. And if they're not, there's obviously resources available depending on what the crisis is that you can actually, even as a concerned loved one or friend, could call as well.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that
Yeah.
because I think that will take the pressure off of someone who doesn't want to push them off the edge, but can see that you're really struggling. So thank you for
Yeah.
bringing that up. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and the honestly that whole 988 hotline has some great resources on their website, even just like templates to use to like how to talk to somebody, whether you're the person struggling, like say you just like you want to ask for help, but like I can relate to this. Every little task seems so difficult. Like you're just so almost catatonic in a way. So like
Yeah.
even just like the concept of like what do I say to somebody? They have great templates for that. And then similarly for the person who might be concerned about somebody, like things you could say to them. And it obviously it's a crisis line, but it's also they are not expecting most people. Most people are not medical professionals, and even the ones who are, we're not trained as psychiatrists, right? So like we shouldn't be able to tell the difference necessarily between what's a crisis and what's not. You can always call them. And,
Yeah.
I'd err on the side of that. I think you'll never regret doing it.
Yeah. So, as the saying says, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And you've gone through a lot. And here you are now on the horizon of, on the verge of a new start, a fresh start, selling your house, moving to a new area, moving from New Hampshire to the South, Tennessee, leaving your big fluffy coats to now wearing shorts 9 months of the year, maybe for you, 12 months out of the year, adjusting to the temperature change. But now you have a fresh start. So just talk to us about some of the emotions and feelings that you have around this new opportunity.
Yeah, I honestly had my emotions get a little, I mean, I wouldn't say out of control, because I've now become much more, I think, in tune with them,
Yeah.
and like I know it's okay to cry for both good and sad reasons. But just a couple of weeks ago, I actually had to fly down to Tennessee, so I was applying for my medical license, and naturally there's questions that, regardless of how great the state is about mental health, like I'm always going to have to answer yes to, because I have a prior action on my
Right.
license.
Yeah.
And so, in New Hampshire, for example, I had already set myself up with the physician health program there to kind of transfer my monitoring and their medical board. I answered the questions, but I already had this thing in place, and they were kind of like, okay, well, great. Like, here's your license then. Like, and every state's different. So Tennessee is actually, honestly, really great. They do want to interview you,
Mhm.
but it's mainly, and I can understand this. I mean, some people, you see something on paper and like it doesn't translate when you actually meet them in person. Like who knew? Maybe I could have had my lawyer write all of this stuff and I
Right.
didn't mean any of
Yeah.
it. Like I can
Sure.
definitely respect that they would want to see me in person. But they were, I mean, I knew I was gonna walk out of there, with a license. It was more like, I had talked to the physician health program in Tennessee because I'll be working with them now. I might have like broken the record for the most states in terms of doing a little tour of PHPs everywhere. But anyway, like they basically have you give a statement, just kind of tell us about yourself essentially, but in the context of your issues. And what I wasn't expecting was kind of the response I got after I was done, which was like every single member of the board. And I had already sat through several, I think there was like 15 doctors who were applying that had to interview for various reasons. Like some of them had nothing to do with substance stuff. It was like other things. But, most of the time they would like, the person would give a statement, medical board would maybe have a little bit of a back and forth, and then they'd just like vote, be done. In
Yeah.
my case, like each one of them kind of took the microphone and would say just like these really kind, heartfelt words about similar on a lot of what you said, like just that they were so proud of what steps I've taken, and that it would be a privilege to have me as a doctor in this state. And I'm like, wasn't planning on getting emotional, obviously, but like tears are well, it's just one of those things. Like it felt like the culmination of all of these things. And I had obviously worked since having gotten into recovery, but it was such a short-lived first job that,
Yeah.
and obviously there was I think honestly that's how it felt, was just like all these emotions coming up from everything, all the rejections I had gotten over the past year, frustrations, the uncertainty. And like, I obviously was very grateful and everything. And back in December when I had gotten Dr. Vertrees had offered me the job, but then now it's becoming so much more real because, okay, like here's my license, and they
Yeah.
had said all these beautiful things. And then basically, unanimously voted, gave me an unrestricted medical license. And honestly, I'm just so proud to be a physician in that state, because they really are like walking the walk when it comes to understanding their duty is to protect the public, of course, but whenever possible, it was so great, honestly, even in other cases, not mine, seeing how thoughtful they were, also considering the physicians, the impact on the physician whenever possible. If there was a balance between the two, they would always try and strike that balance. And that's not been my experience in other states. In fact, like some states are still wanting to discipline me for an action I had a few years ago. Like in Massachusetts, for example, I'm actually, having to deal with some kind of silly, whatever you want to call it, bureaucratic rules about reciprocal actions like 3 years later. So it was honestly great to have that be going there. And yeah, like I think honestly, the way I've thought about it is this whole time, because it's been about a year or a little over a year now, but I had been talking very closely with my sponsor, who's actually not a doctor, but she's just been such a great support. And kind of like the general vibe is like, I know that there's a reason you're having to wait this long. And I just like, obviously that, she was hurting for me, and I still have a lot of hope, but it was like, why is it taking so long? Come on, like I'm doing
Right.
everything I'm supposed to do. What,
Sure.
And what was funny is that at the time when I first was looking, I wasn't looking to stay, move outside of New England. This was We had just purchased a home here, so I really was trying to stay in this area. And I had, again, been listening to Dr. Vertrees' podcast for a couple of years, so I've really just loved her insight on things and how she just seemed like such a cool person to, she'd be like, I remember thinking this would be a great person to work with. Like, what an awesome mentor it would be to have this as an early career doc. But man, I'm never moving to Tennessee. And
Yeah.
then, I just needed to have some circumstances arise where I was open to other geographic locations. And now I actually have the perfect job for me. I just wasn't open to it before because it was outside of where I was looking. But like, it really is like, I would have settled, honestly, if I had stayed here in New England, at least for what was available at this time. So it's just, it's really amazing. And then being able to work with somebody who's, again, really encouraged me to just be my true authentic self. I'm going to get to learn from that same person who I'm going to maybe occasionally ask to bail me out of the OR on
Yeah.
cases, is the same person who I get to learn like all the business aspects and all of the just coaching aspects. And, because I do have aspirations of, right now, I don't have a platform. I'm kind of doing the podcast tour and seeing where it takes me, because I really want to focus on getting back into my clinical, getting cases and getting back, my feel for things in the OR. I don't want to get too distracted, but like
Right.
ultimately I do want to have both, like you do, like she does,
Yeah.
and be
Sure.
able to help doctors in that manner as well. Not only that, but also to have some, I think, a backup plan if things income wise don't work out.
Sure. Well, don't even worry about that, because right now you're a new surgeon. You're really a new surgeon, even though this is your second start. So you have to
Agreed.
focus on being a good surgeon.
Yes.
I promise you, your story will be impactful in 2024, in 2028, in 2030. Your ability to help people will only grow as time goes by. So I'm going to just speak to that fear, or that if you don't do it now, it's going to go away,
Mhm.
because as you continue to mature and as you continue to grow and as you continue to become the surgeon that can help people both clinically, you're going to run into patients every day that struggle, and you're going to be able to help them right there at the bedside. And then you'll later be able to help them help other people on stage, but your time is coming. So don't even feel the pressure of that.
Well, I
This has been,
appreciate that.
yeah, such a great episode. Typically, I always have a final timeout, but today I'm going to provide the final timeout. And as I listened to you talk, the scripture came to my mind of, I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future, because that's truly what's going on in your life right now. Yeah.
Jeremiah 22:11. That's my husband's favorite scripture quote. So I'm gonna force him to watch this episode just to hear the ending there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So I don't have anything else to add. Yeah, I'm really glad that you came on. I'm really glad that you shared your story, and you have to come back later.
Absolutely. I would love that. Maybe
To
we can even do a
Yeah.
joint episode with Dr. Vertrees.
Yeah.
I know you've been trying to get her on your platform as well, and probably schedules
Yeah.
just haven't allowed. But no,
Well,
I'm
I finally
happy
was able to
to.
get her. I was supposed to have her on at the same time with Amanda Hill, but I was finally
Oh
able to
yes.
get her, I guess, probably about a month ago. And that's when I asked her. I always ask for them to recommend someone else, and she recommended you. So,
That's funny.
yeah.
She's been so, I mean, obviously she's so great on so many levels, but this isn't the first time she's done this. She just sort
Yeah.
of, I mean, she knew I've been wanting to, at least share my story a little bit and whatever. So she's, I know, done with that with Dr. Jillian Rigert and a couple of other
Mhm.
people who I'll
She's
be
been on the show as
coming on.
well.
She's
That's funny.
fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
great. Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure. And
Absolutely.
I'm also happy to, I think I shared my social stuff. So anybody who, relates or wanted to reach out, even if it's just a, lend a friendly ear, I'm always happy to do that. Be the person I, wish I had a few years ago.
Sure. Just tell us your social. It'll be in the show notes, but just tell us out loud.
Yeah. So I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn and Instagram. Facebook and LinkedIn, I think it's just like if you just search Courtney Barrows McKeown, I put the links in there. And then
Yeah.
I'm Court B McKeown on Instagram. But I think if you search my name, you should be able to find me too.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, you have a lot more fans now. I can guarantee you that. Well, thank you again.
Have a great night.
All right. Thank you for continuing to support this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, then please leave a 5-star review. And if you haven't done so, subscribe so you continue to get the updated episodes. Until later, peace.
Hey, time out with the sports doctor. Keep our head right in the game. We ain't never stopping. You are now tuned in. Trust you don't want to miss. This is where life, sports, and medicine